everyone, I'm Allie Buckman with the Potomac Bead Company, and I'm going to be doing this bracelet for you today featuring our disc duo bead as well as some crescents and some two-hole triangles. This is the Architect bracelet. It's going to be using multiple components and then sewing those components together. This is 2/3 of the bracelet done, and I'll finish and show you how to make this set and then how to join them together. All together, we're going to end up with 5 of our components being sewn together. If you need any of the materials to make this Architect bracelet, you can look on the left-hand side here. We'll do a little drop down. That way you can purchase from me online if you need to, or you can write it down, go to your local Potomac Bead Company, and shop there as well. Again, this design is featuring our disc duo bead here in the middle. The disc duo, I'm going to be using 2 different colors. For the disc duo to be the connector areas here, I'm using our jade color. Altogether, for the connector ones, you're going to use 6 of that color. In the middle of my little floral designs here, I actually have what would be closest to zinc iris, and I'm going to use 6 of those. These actually came out of our ancient gold mix, which is a nice soft colored mix of some of the different metallics. So I just pulled out the ones that are the closest in color, kind of with that taupey gold color or taupey brown color. In addition to the disc duo beads, I have the Persian turquoise here in the 2-hole triangle. The 2-hole triangle is a checkmate bead, and when you look at it here, it has the 2 holes at the bottom and then the triangle at the top. I've chosen the Persian turquoise color for those to really make the crescents kind of pop and to bring in that color. For the 2-hole triangles, we are using 4 per component, and I'm doing 5 components total, so I'm going to need 20 of those 2-hole triangles. On the sides and the top of the 2-hole triangles, we have our crescent beads. I'm featuring 2 colors of crescents. The black currant is here along the top, sitting and framing the actual disc duo. And for the black currant bead, you need 4 per component, which would be 20 because I'm doing 5. And then you also need 2 for each side for your link. So you're going to look about 30 altogether of those. In addition to the black currant, I'm using another color of the crescent bead, and this color is the metallic khaki color. You can also use the metallic gold or the metallic matte gold. That would look pretty with it as well too. So I have the khaki color here, or the metallic tan would work. I have that khaki color here that's going to pick up the color of the disc duo. For those, I am using 4 per component, so altogether I'm going to need 20 of those since I'm doing 5 of my components. Stringing them all together, I'm going to be using some 11 and some 15 size seed beads. For the 11 size seed beads, I'm using the Crystal Labrador color, which is a check coating on the Miyuki seed bead. So we're using that in that nice bright silver color. The gold color that I'm using is the 15-0 in the galvanized dark yellow gold, and I'm using that to kind of pick up those metallic colors as well. A lot of times I like to use the seed beads just in the metallic colors because it really makes the beads pop and it makes it look a little more bezel set. To finish off the bracelet, I am going to be using a button here, and this is one of our pewter buttons, and it's the Crystal Vortex button. It has a shank on the back there. And to connect the button actually to the bracelet, I'm going to be using 2 of my wire protectors here. I have 2 silver-plated wire protectors. It's sewn all together with 0.006 wildfire beading thread, and I'm using the green color, which is going to hide a lot of my thread nicely in my project since my colors kind of tend towards that green color. I'm using a size 10 needle for the project. You can use a size 10 or a 12. A 12 might be easier to get in between some of the rows as we work with it. That's up to you. I prefer a stiffer needle, so I'm going with the 10, but either of those sizes would work. I also have some super new glue sitting here handy, my Thread Zap 2. I'm working on a bead mat, and it's good to have a little pair of pliers handy too, so that way you can pinch down the ends of the thread as you burn them in order to thread your needle. To get started, we will be doing one of the components. So each little piece here is a component, and then we're adding those pieces together with a separate piece of thread. I have 3 components here that I made independently, and I just joined 2 together so you could see the base of the bracelet starting to happen. We'll make 2 more components together, and I'll show you how to actually add them together and how to attach your clasp. To get started with my first component, I have my sets of 4 sitting out. So I have 4 of my crescents in the current, 4 in that khaki color, and then 4 of my triangles. I also have sitting out 1 of my disc duos, and then my little pile of beads. Onto a 4-foot piece of thread, I have a stop bead that I've made using a random bead that's not part of my project, which will come off. It is put on the thread, and then the needle goes through it 2 times, which is going to expose 2 pieces of thread on the outside of it in order for you to take it off eventually. And I just have about a 2-inch tail because I'm just going to be tying on. It actually doesn't even need to be that long. I'll push it down to about 1 inch. Once I have that on, I'm going to pick up my crescents that are on the inside of my actual component. These are the current crescents, and the first thing I'm going to do is pick up 1 of the crescents. I'm going to pick it up going through the second hole as the crescent is arched up. I'm always going to think for this design about the crescent being arched up rather than down. Going through the second hole, I'm going to take that crescent down next to my stop bead. Once I have that first crescent in there, we're going to do a pattern of 15, 11, 15, which is going to connect the crescents on the inside. Again, with the crescent shaping up, I'm going to go through the crescent through the right hand hole of the crescent and push that down. Once that's on, I'm actually going to add my 2-hole triangle. The 2-hole triangle is going to go through with the triangle facing up, again through that right hand hole. When I'm on the exterior of the triangle, I'm going to add 3 15s, and so back through the second hole of the triangle as well as the second hole of the crescent. Give a nice tight pull to kind of get those into place. Again, I'm at a corner here, so I'm going to add 15, 11, 15, picking up a crescent, again with that crescent shape, the U shape up, and go into that right hand side. When I pull that on, I'm then going to get my 2-hole triangle, again facing up through the right hand side. While I have my needle in my hand, I'll pick up 3 of my 15-ohs, let that all drop down next to the crescent, and go through the second hole of both the triangle and the crescent in towards the center of my box here. The 4 crescents are going to create a little bit of a boxing effect that we're then going to sew the round duo into. Once I have that third one on, I'm going to repeat the 15, 11, 15 and repeat adding the current on the right hand side, also picking up a 2-hole triangle, face up on the right hand side, my 3 15s, pushing them all down, take the needle and go through the second hole of the triangle and the second hole of the crescent. Once I have that 4th one on, you can see it'll sit funny. What I want to actually do is make sure that it sits in my square. To sit in the square and to connect to the last crescent, 15, 11, 15 get added, and I'm going to sew through the open hole of this crescent here, which would be the right hand side. When I'm coming at that crescent, I add my last triangle and my 3 15s. Push that all down next to the project. And I'm going to sew through that triangle and through the crescent. When you sew through the crescent, you would just want to try to move that stop bead kind of off to the side. I want my needle and thread to come out right after the crescent, not connecting to any of the seed beads. Give a nice tight pull. You can see it's kind of jumbled here. What I want to do then is force my beads to sit open. So you can see that shape there. When you look in the example, it gets folded back and opened up, which we'll be doing as we add some of our next rows of our beads. When I'm here at the center, I want to add my disc duo bead. To add the disc duo bead, my needle and thread are coming out of the crescent. I'm going to sew through the first 15 and the first 11 that I put on my project. Give the thread a nice tight tug. When I'm coming out of that 11 right there, I'm going to pick up my disc duo. Let it drop into the center of our crescents. And I'm going to sew from the 11-0 that I'm coming out of straight across to the next 11-0 in line. And just through the 11-0. That's going to lock that first hole of the disc duo in place. To come back through the disc duo, I'm going to turn my needle and thread, coming back through the same hole of that disc duo bead and out the end. To connect to the second side of the disc duo bead, I'm going to go through the second hole of the disc duo, coming out this first hole here. It's going to expose a little bit of my thread on the outside of my disc duo. I'm not going to worry about that. Pick up the 11 on the other side of the disc duo. There I have that disc duo now stuck in there, and I still have one corner sitting up. We're going to come back through the disc duo and also back through the 11-0 seed bead. When I come through the 11-0 seed bead, I want to come through the seed bead on the side so I can sew then up towards my stopper bead. Pulling that nice and tight. My needle and thread are then going to go through my crescent, because I'm back at the beginning almost, and through the 2-hole triangle. Go through the 11-0s, or I'm sorry, the 15-0s at the top of the crescent, and through the crescent bead, or through the triangle bead, sorry. Coming out before the crescent then, I'm at the point right where my stop bead is. To get my stop bead out and not part of my project, I'm going to pull the stop bead out and knot the threads together so the starter thread and the thread I'm working with are held together by a knot. That's going to allow me to get a nice tight knot in there, and that triangle gets closer so the stop bead is not in the way. I'm just going to tie 2 knots. And you can keep that stop bead on there if you want, or you can burn the thread down slower. I'm going to keep the stop bead on there and just keep it out of the way. Once I have that knot, I'm going to go back through my 2-hole triangle from the bottom portion next to the crescent, back through the other hole on this opposite side, and out the top of that same 2-hole triangle. If you need to, you can kind of push the beads off to the side so that way they are not included as you go through the top of that triangle. Here's where I said if you do like to use a 12 or you don't mind using an 11 or 12 needle, you may want to do so because we are going in between the crescent and the 2-hole triangle, which becomes a tight space. Now that we have our center of our box here, we're going to be moving on to adding our next set of our crescent beads in that metallic khaki color. To add the next set of crescents, again, we're thinking of them as being face up. This time as we go around, we're not going to add in the right-hand hole, we're going to be adding in the left-hand hole. Before each crescent, I want to add an 11L. So through the crescent, and then at the top of the crescent, add an 11, 15, 11. Once I'm through that first hole of the crescent and I have those beads at the top, I'm going to come down through the second hole of the crescent, which is going to pull those beads in to decorate the top of that crescent. Coming out of the crescent, I pick up an 11O seed bead, and I'm going to sew down through the next triangle around my square. When I sew through the triangle, I want to bend the beads a little bit so I'm only sewing through the triangle with my needle coming out before the crescent. Give a nice tight pull because that's what's going to start to have your crescents lay back. Take your needle now to the other hole of that 2-hole triangle, push it through the top, and add your next crescent. Make sure that thread doesn't get trapped at all. Nice tight pull, add your next crescent. Again, the crescent gets added with an 11O through the left-hand hole of the crescent. An 11O, a 15, and an 11 get added to decorate the end of the crescent. Push it down towards your project. Sew back through that other hole of the crescent coming in towards the center of the project and pick up an 11O. Going around this this square here, pick up the next crescent and sew in towards the center. Going through that triangle there before the crescent, we're going to hop over from one hole to the next hole, and that's going to hide our thread behind the triangle. If we sew down into the crescent, I tried that at first, you actually see the thread exposed here, and when the crescent pops back, it doesn't look very attractive. So that's why we're forcing our needle in between that triangle, going from the one hole down in between the triangle and the crescent and back up the other hole. I'm going to do this 2 more times, adding in my crescent bead with that decorative end and sewing down into the triangle and up to the other side. Once I get that 11O on there, again going to the next triangle, kind of bend it back so you can get that needle to come out, sewing just through the triangle, and you're always sewing down the triangle and up the triangle to add. And that's going to pull that crescent in. Give your thread a nice tight pull. That's going to start to get that shape occurring of that little bit of that dome. Because when you look at the back of it here, it really is set up quite a dome shape and sits up very nicely. And that's what gets that folded back appearance. When I'm through the triangle there at the bottom, I'm going to go up the triangle on the other side. If you happen to get your needle through one of the 15s, you can just take that out. Give a nice tight pull, and then get ready to add my last crescent in place. So I have my last crescent in place, and I'm getting ready to go back to the starting triangle to go down through that first side. Once you have that last crescent, here's where you do want to give a lot of tension on your thread and give a nice tight pull, again, to get that dome shape. And as you can see, it helps to achieve more of that kind of puffed out look of that little flower shape. The last thing we're going to be doing is kind of reinforcing that arch and that shape by adding in 5 15O seed beads between our crescent beads. To do that, I'm going to be coming out of my 11O here. To get over to that 11O and to go around from 11 to 11, I'm going to go through this triangle one more time, going from one side to the other, taking the thread through, go through the 11-0 of this crescent, up the crescent then, all the way to come out the 11-0 on the other side of the crescent. Right now, if we did not add in our 5 15-0s like we're going to do, you have your shape that can be kind of pushed back and forth. So we're adding these next 5 15-0s really to give it stability, because right now I could kind of push those crescents up and down and see they move back and forth. Our beads that we're adding into place now will help to get that to be more stable. Coming out of 15-0 on the side of the crescent, or the 11-0 on the side of the crescent there, I'm going to add in 5 15s. And then I'm going to jump over to the next 11-0 and sew up that. Again, up through the crescent and the beads that are there. Then you're going to go down the crescent on the other side, down through the 11-0, and pop your needle out. When you're out the 11-0, 5 more seed beads go on, and these are my gold 15s. Over to the next 11-0, underneath the crescent, through the crescent, reinforcing it by going through all those beads, down through the crescent, coming out that 11-0 on the other side. Again here I'll go and add 5 more 15s, going the whole way around, adding those 15s in place. When you see the 15s then in place, you can see on the back here that you'll see the 3 15s sit right underneath the 5, creating that nice kind of dome shape. So I have 2 of them done, and I'm going to go in and do the last 2. At this point, I've added my last 5 15s, and all I need to do is actually tie off my thread. When you're going around and creating this little component, you want to make sure that your 5 seed beads that you're adding sit on top of those 3. So make sure as you're going around that the bottom set of seed beads that you're looking have 3. I have this original starter thread, which I'm just kind of holding off to the side, and I'm coming out that crescent that I just finished putting those 5 beads in place. Just like I've been doing, I'm going to go through the seed beads above the crescent, down the crescent, and down the 11-0 seed bead. You can see I have a lot of extra thread on. That's going to be used to do my next component. What I am going to do now is sew down underneath one of these seed beads and connect to the thread underneath. I want to try to get the thread before the seed beads, and I want to try to get my knot to be to the back of the project. Once I have my thread or my needle underneath one of those threads, I'm going to sew through and create a loop. I've sewn my needle through that loop one time. I'm going to sew it through a second time. The thread then will be twisted around that loop, and that's going to create a little sewer's knot. Pull that nice and tightly and get it right down there in between some of those beads. Sewing right along the bottom to another 11-0 seed bead, right along that line of 3. I'm going to do the same thing, hiding my thread. So I'm going underneath one of those bridge threads, making my loop, sewing my needle through that thread once and twice. I'm going to pull that knot down nice and close. Once you have those 2 knots in place, I'm going to take my super glue and just do a tiny little dab of glue right along that knot section. I'm going to do it on one side and the other side. The last thing I'm going to do is drop a tiny little bit right between that 2-hole triangle and the crescent where my original knot was formed. I'm then going to take my thread burner, burn off that extra thread, and then take the burner again and burn that thread end down against the project. Same with the one here, burn it down so that it balls up in the project. Once you have that, you have your first little component made. You can see here that I've already have these 3 components that I have made, and this will be my 4th component. I have one more component to make, and then I'll be adding them together, 1, 2, and 1 at the end here. So I'll have the 3 little sections with my jade bead that I add, but I'm going to make one more component in the exact same fashion as I just did this one, creating it and letting it sit independently on the project. If you want to, you can rewind this video and go back and watch how to do this same exact one, so that way you're ready to get the components kind of together and to learn how to put them together. So go ahead and make one more of these, and then we'll come back together and we'll add the components together with our jade disc duo. Once the components are done, it's time to add them together. I added the original 3 components that I did together, and I've made these 2 new separate ones. We're going to add these 2 separate pieces together, and then I'll show how we attach to the bracelet itself, which is the exact same technique. You should have extra needle and thread left over from your project, which you can keep on and keep using the same thread. I also left the needle and thread attached to the one that I did here, just to show you that you can cut that and basically do your next attachment section with that thread and needle as well. The attachment section does use the current color of the disc duos, or of the, of the actual crescents, and then we're going to use that jade color of the disc duo in the middle. On the inside of the crescents here, we're going to be adding some 15 seed beads. On the outside of the crescents, we're going to be decorating the sides with our 11 on the top and the 15s on the side, creating that little picot trim. To start out, I have my thread and needle here, and I'm going to take my thread and needle through the 3 beads on the side of one of the crescents. When I'm coming out of that third 11L, I'm going to add a 15 seed bead, and I'm going to add my first crescent. The first crescent I add, I'm going to add in that same U shape on the left-hand side. On goes then a 15, 11, 15, and I come back down the crescent. When I'm back down the crescent here, I want to add in another 15, and I'm going to sew to attach to the other one through those 3 beads on the side of that metallic khaki crescent. When you're stitching these together too, you just want to make sure that you're stitching in the correct direction, that your components will sit next to one another, and that one is not upside down. Now that I have those 2 on, you can see that first crescent kind of sitting in place there. I'm going to get ready to add my next crescent. My next crescent, as I look through it here, you're going to want it to sit up and facing directly across from the other crescent. I'm going to come in through that right-hand side through the back there, and that's going to create that little crescent connection. On goes a 15, 11, 15, and back down the crescent on the other side. When I'm exiting the crescent here on this second hole, I'm going to put on a 15-0 seed bead, and I'm going to tie my 2 thread ends together. If you wanted to, you could have put a stop bead there to hold the bead in place. I just let the thread hang out. I want to make sure that my knot goes between the 15-0 and the 11-0 in that little section there, and then I'm not going to see the extra thread. I'm going to tie another knot to make sure that this connection stays really well, and I will glue this knot also. Again, if you're someone that doesn't like to glue, you may want to take this thread end and put on a needle and weave it back into your project. For now, I'm going to push that off to the side. Now that I have my knot, I'm going to sew through my 11-0 seed bead and let my needle come out right after it. When the needle is coming out the 11-0 seed bead, we're going to do just like we did in the middle of the crescents here. I'm going to be adding my little disc duo here in my jade color, sewing through the first hole of the jade disc duo, and I'm going to go laterally over to the other 11-0, go through the 15 and go through the 11, and then come out. That's going to lock that first hole of that disc duo in place, fold the disc duo over the top, and I'm going to go through the second hole of the disc duo. That locks that second hole in the disc duo into place, and I'm going to go through the 11, 15, 11 on that first starter side. It's getting tight, so if you need to come out after one of the beads, you can. I'm going to go through this, reinforcing it again. And the knot's right on the other side there. So you may need to kind of play with it a little bit to get it through that 11. But I'm going to reinforce this and go through the whole area here of my crescents again. So I'm going to come out that 11-0 and go through the whole outer edge of the crescents one more time. Once you reinforce the sides here of the pendant, you are back, or of the connection, you are back to the point where you have the actual starter knot. I'm going to flip the project over, bringing that knot towards the back, and tie those 2 thread ends together. Once I have that knot tied together, I'm going to take my thread burner, burn down the extra thread, still leaving myself plenty on that initial thread in order to make my next connection. Once I have those ends there, you can burn down a little bit closer. Glue if you want to, and create a balled end with that thread by using your thread burner to burn down the edges. Try as much as possible to take that knot and push it towards the back. I now have my 2 separate component pieces, and what I'm going to do is add them together by doing the same thing again, going around in a circle, adding my crescents, and then jumping back in between the 2 groups of 3 to add in my next disc duo. Go ahead and add here your components together, those 5 components, and then I'm going to add my end components in order to hook on my clasp and a loop for my clasp to go through. Just showing that connection again, I have my thread that I've taken through those 3 beads. I've added a 15-0 seed bead and gone through the crescent, added the picot trim, and I'm coming back down the crescent. Add another 15-0 seed bead, and use this opportunity to connect the 2 sides together. Once I have those 2 sides connected together, I'm going to pick up another 15, go through my crescent, adding my trim, back through the crescent, in towards the middle, add another 15-0 seed bead, and then the tying of my 2 threads together. Once my 2 threads get tied together, I'm going to take my needle, add my disc duo, and then reinforce my sides. That creates my little box for me to sew through the 11 O's and connect in a rectangle form or a square form that disc duo bead. I'm going to then reinforce the sides to finish that off. Now all of my components are put together and I just need to do my ends. The end on one side will have a loop and on the other side I'll attach my button clasp to it. In order to add my ends, I'd need to do 2 more of my little connectors, 1 on each end. I did neglect to say in the beginning of the video that you would actually need 2 more of the metallic khaki crescents. If you don't have those metallic khaki crescents, you can actually just make a little triangle here at the end in order to attach your clasp to. I have the metallic khaki crescents, so I am going to be using those. Just like we've been doing, we're going to make this little box here out of our crescents and our disc duo bead. To start, I'm going to go up through those 3 beads, just like I have been doing. You can see I'm just using a piece of thread end here that I had from one of my components. I'm going to add a 15 and my crescent. Coming out the top of the crescent, I'll decorate it like I did all the others by doing that little picot trim on my 15s and the 11 in the middle, and come down the crescent on the other side. When I'm down the crescent on the other side, I'm going to add a 15-0, and I'm going to add one of my metallic khaki crescents going through the left-hand hole as it sits like a watermelon slice. Coming out the top, I add that picot trim and go into the crescent on the other side, in towards the middle. To finish off my square, I'm going to add a 15 and my second crescent going in the left-hand side, going from the back towards the front, and I'm going to add that picot trim again. Go back through that crescent, and that's going to help to make my box. Once I have those 3 crescents on, I'm going to add 1 more of my 15-0 crescents. And I'm going to knot the thread end to the thread that I'm using. Again, if you wanted to, you could have put a stop bead there, but this is just like we have been doing, except instead of adding on to the crescent that was already there on the right-hand side, we are actually adding a new crescent. Once I have that tied off, you're going to want to pull nice and tight to make sure that you don't have any thread slack showing. Lay the crescents out so they behave here on the sides. And I'm going to take my thread and needle up through those 3 beads that are on the side, from the original side, up through the 15-0 in the crescent, I'm going to go through the picot trim and basically coming down to the other side. What I'm doing right now is adding in my seed beads on the inside of my second crescent. That way I have something to connect into my disc duo bead. So I've gone back through the crescents here, coming out that bottom crescent. I'm going to go through the 15-0. That's there between that polychrome and between the khaki crescent. When I'm coming out the 15, I'm going to add an 11, a 15, and an 11. And I'm going to sew into the next 15-0 and go through the second polychrome one. You can see then that gives the seed beads in the middle, and that's going to be my place to add my final disc duo bead. sewing through the project here, just like I did previously. We're going to connect all the beads, sewing up through the 11, the 15, and the 11 on that first side of the crescent. Taking my thread and needle out. When I'm coming out there, it's time to add my disc duo. Put it through one hole of the disc duo, come down those 3 center beads on the opposite side, the 11, 15, 11 that we just added. Make sure that disc duo sits right on top. Grab the disc duo's second hole and sew through those 3 beads on the left-hand side. And take your thread and needle out. That's going to pull that disc duo right in place there, just like we've been doing, adding it into the middle of that connector component. What we are going to do now is take this thread, rather than cutting it off, I'm going to go through the piece, through that 15-0, through the crescent, through the picot trim, through the crescent, and I'm going the whole way to get out to the picot trim on the khaki crescent that was added. So I'm going up through the project now, coming out the end. When I come out the end of the project here, I'm going to go through the 15 and the 11. And when you're out the 11, we add on our button. You can either add the button or the loop at this point. And if you want to, and you're adding a different clasp, you can do that as well. You could add a cup button, you can add a lobster, whatever's up to you, whatever you prefer. I'm going to be adding again this pewter button, and I have my wire protector to add with it. When I'm coming out that center bead, I'm going to add 3 of my 11-0 seed beads and let those drop down next to the 11-0 that was previously there. I want to make sure that my cup button sits next to, or that my button sits next to the project and not over the top of the project. So I'm actually going to add 2 more 11-0s, and then I'm going to go up into my wire protector. The wire protector, if you haven't used it, it's a little U-shaped channel where the ends have a tube on each side and the middle almost has a rounded track. I'm going to make sure that my thread runs in that track, going in one side and coming through to the other. And make sure again that that thread sits right inside that track. Once the thread is inside the track, I'm going to take my needle, go through my button, and get that button shank to lay right inside that wire protector. That's going to protect the thread from rubbing right against the clasp. It'll be hidden in this wire protector. On the other side of the wire protector, I'm going to include 5 of my 11-0s, just like I did on the first side. To reinforce this, I'm going to go back through that 1 11-0 that I was coming out of and pull. You can see now the button's going to lay right next to it rather than on top of the project. I probably could have done 4 beads, maybe even gotten away with that 3, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. As I go again here, I'm going to reinforce by going up those 5 beads, up my wire protector here on the side, and through my clasp. So I'm just making sure that I have the thread through more than one time, since this is where most of my tension is going to be. When you come down the other side of the wire protector, you want to make sure that the second wire also sits in that little track. After I have that reinforced, I'm going to give a nice tight pull to make sure any extra thread slack is tightened up. I'm going to go back down that 11-0 seed bead at the center of that clasp and follow back through my project. This is going to tighten that up as well as give me an opportunity to end my thread further down in my project. When I flip over the project, I'm going to knot my thread somewhere along the back here, just like I did on the previous sections of my little links. So that's going to get knotted on the back and just glued off with that thread knotted. On the second side, I'm going to do the exact same thing, but instead of doing a button, I'm going to do a loop for the button to sit on. The second side here, when measuring, and I actually want to keep this bracelet for myself, so when measuring, because my wrist is a little bit smaller than average, I'm actually going to keep off the last component and go directly, or the last connection and go directly into the component to make my loop. If you are creating a lobster clasp or using a toggle or something, you will use that second of your wire protector. If you're just making a loop out of beads like I'm using, you'll just put that off to the side. You just have the one that's going to be on the button. On the second side here, whether or not you're going into one of your connectors or just going onto the component, it's going to be the same. I have an 11-0 sitting, or two 15-0s sitting right on my thread first, and then an 11-0. I then have a 15-0, and I'm doing a collection of 11-0 beads in order to be big enough for my loop to sit through, or for my clasp to sit through. Once I get the loop the size that I want it to be, I'm going to add a 15-0, and I'm going to come back into that first original 11-0 that I put on. Once I'm through there, I'm going to add two 15-0s. And then I'm going to tie my thread ends together. Before I tie, just looking at this, I know I'm going to need to make my loop a little bit bigger. So before you tie off, you just want to make sure that your button is actually going to fit on. I'm going to add about 5 more seed beads and then repeat this same thing. Now that my loop is a good size, I have my 15-0s on, and I'm going to retrace through my entire end here. So I'm going back through these 3 seed beads, just kind of holding that tail in place. Again, if you feel more comfortable putting on a stop bead, you can do that as well. I'm going to pull that loop nice and tight. You can see it has that little kind of V there at the start. I like the look of that for the start of my clasps. The reason I used the 15-0 seed beads there is because it comes together nicely also next to the 11-0 seed bead. I'm going to retrace my entire clasp and bring my thread out right next to my thread end. When the thread comes out next to the thread end, you can choose to do a third time around, which I am going to do, and then I'm just going to tie off my thread 2 ends together. I've gone through that loop 3 times to reinforce, and I'm just tying off the end of the thread with the original starter piece. I want to try as much again to get that knot to the back of my project. If you want, you can also take your thread and weave it back through the project a little bit more. When I'm at the end here then, I'm just going to take a little bit of my super glue glue, just do a dab onto that thread end. If you have any extra, you can just kind of blot it off on a piece of paper towel. And then I'm going to burn my thread ends down. Once those thread ends are burned down, your bracelet is completed. So whether or not you do that last little connector or go right into the clasp like I did end up with the 5 components that are joined together by those little connectors. So I ended up with 5 connectors. If you have a standard size wrist, you'll probably need to do that last connector in order to make your bracelet fit. I have a smaller wrist, and in order to wear it, there's no way that it would stay on my wrist with that last connector. So you can do the clasp smaller if you want to do that last connector, or kind of do it to fit however you prefer. It really does come out to be a great, fun bracelet. I love the colors, and it's a little bit more challenging because you need to make all of the pieces first and connect them together. And usually I lose interest by the time kind of I get to that point. I know a lot of you guys are the same way when it's different components made, but stick with it. It really does make a really cool bracelet. You can also do the individual pieces and join them together in a different way. You could make it a nice necklace piece as well going down, or even these as stud earrings. They would look really great with the little flower components there individually. If you hadn't had a chance to play with some of these awesome Czech products, you can go back to the beginning of the video. You can purchase them from me online, or you can get them in our Potomac Bead Company locations. It's a fun use to see the different shape of the crescents, as well as the poking out of those little two-hole triangles, featuring then our disc duo in the middle. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and to stay connected, you can also join us on Facebook in our beading and jewelry making group. Ask to become a member there and interact with other beaders, as well as us more intimately. Also subscribe to this YouTube channel and you'll get regular updates on different patterns like this Architect bracelet, as well as new things like the new products that we're getting in, the new coatings, and all of the things happening with Potomac Bead Company. Thanks a lot for watching, everyone, and have fun making this Architect bracelet.